He survived the battlefield but lost everything afterward, until a loyal dog led him to a forgotten storage unit. Inside waited a photo, a key, and the truth about a missing soldier. What he uncovered would shake his faith, his courage, and the meaning of duty itself. Don't miss what happens next. Hit like, subscribe, and see how honor never dies even when men do. The wind howled across frozen Montana plains, snow swallowing the world. Inside an old Ford pickup, the wipers dragged across a windshield coated in ice, fighting a losing battle. Mark Sullivan, 52, kept his hands firm on the wheel knuckles, white beneath worn gloves. The dashboard light flickered weakly. He hadn't felt heat in hours. In the rearview mirror, Emma, his 11-year-old daughter, lay curled up under a wool blanket that had seen too many winters. Her breath fogged the glass. Next to her, Rex, a German shepherd with gray in his muzzle and a scar that split his right ear, lifted his head every time the truck rattled over ice. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the horizon as if guarding them from the storm itself. "Hang in there, kiddo." Mark muttered, his voice rough from years of shouting commands in the desert. "We'll be there soon." The words came out automatic, the kind of lie a father tells to keep his child's world from cracking. The old Ford groaned. Gas was low. He had calculated the miles in his head for the third time. Bozeman was still 30 miles away, maybe more. The tank needle trembled near empty. His breath fogged the cabin as he reached over to adjust the heat that no longer worked. A sudden cough came from the back. Emma stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Dad, are we home yet?" He smiled into the mirror, soft and tired. "Almost, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. Rex's paws are cold," she said weakly, wrapping the blanket around the dog. "He's shaking." Mark looked at them, the girl, the dog, the last two reasons he was still moving forward. He reached for the pocket of his jacket, touched the worn photograph inside his late wife in a hospital bed, smiling through pain. He heard her voice again. "Promise me, Mark. Don't let the war take the rest of you. Give her something better." The memory tightened his throat. He turned up the radio, nothing but wind and static. The truck hit a patch of black ice and skidded sideways. Mark gritted his teeth, turning the wheel hard, the tires screaming against the road. The truck slammed to a halt, inches from the guardrail. Silence. Then his heart pounded so loud he could hear it echo. "You okay?" he asked, twisting around. Emma nodded, clutching Rex. The dog growled low, sensing his fear. Mark exhaled, leaning back. He wanted to scream at the sky, at fate, at himself for letting life corner him here, but he didn't. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Not with those two watching him. He restarted the truck. The engine coughed but caught. Through the blur of snow, faint headlights appeared ahead, a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering open. Relief washed over him like heat after frostbite. He pulled in tires, crunching on ice. Inside the diner smelled of coffee and burnt bacon. Only one waitress, mid-50s, stood behind the counter watching an old TV. Her name tag read Marge. "Rough night, huh?" she said, pouring coffee before he asked. "You could say that," Mark replied, rubbing his hands. "Road's closing soon." "Should have been hours ago," she said. "Where you heading?" "Anywhere with work." She gave him a long look, one that measured more than his words. Then her eyes shifted to Emma and Rex, waiting by the door. "She's got your eyes," she said softly. "You a vet?" He nodded. "Thought so." "My brother came back from Fallujah. Never quite came back, though." Mark managed a half smile. "Yeah, that happens a lot." He ate, slowly gave half his sandwich to Emma, a slice of bacon to Rex. The dog chewed tail thumping once, a sound like gratitude. When he paid, Marge slipped something into his palm, a wrinkled flyer. "Storage auction, Saturday. Billings County, cash only. People leave all kinds of things behind," she said, wiping the counter. "Sometimes what they leave ain't junk." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You think luck works like that?" She shrugged. "Luck's just time in wearing a disguise." Before they left, Marge slid 2 prepaid gas cards and a motel discount card across the counter, saying it was a veteran's courtesy. Outside, the storm howled louder, like a challenge. Mark tucked the flyer into his jacket. As he carried Emma back to the truck, Rex following close, the neon light from the diner reflected in the dog's eyes a spark of something that refused to go out. The world was still frozen, still cruel, but for the first time that night, Mark didn't feel completely lost. Maybe, just maybe, the storm was pushing him somewhere he needed to be. The next morning, the storm had eased, but left behind a silence so heavy it hummed. The sky hung low and gray, and the snowbanks along the highway gleamed like glass. Mark drove slowly, squinting through the haze. The heater had given up again. Emma sat up in the back seat, rubbing her eyes, her hair sticking out from under her knit cap. "Dad," she said sleepily, "are we almost in Billings?" "Almost." Mark lied again, glancing at the fuel gauge now kissing empty. Rex lay stretched between them, head on his paws, tail twitching as if dreaming. His ears flicked once, twice, then suddenly stood straight. The dog growled a low warning sound that came from deep in his chest. Mark's eyes followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" he asked. Then he heard it too, a faint metallic rattle carried by the wind. He eased his foot off the gas. The truck rolled to a stop beside a row of abandoned mailboxes buried halfway in snow. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind pressing against metal. Then, to their right through the curtain of snow, a wooden sign swayed from a bent pole. The paint was chipped, half buried in frost, but the words were still legible. "Storage auction today, cash only." Mark frowned, almost laughing at the absurdity. "Well, would you look at that?" he murmured. Emma leaned forward between the seats, her breath fogging the glass. "Dad, can we go?" she asked, her voice suddenly full of life. "It says today, sweetheart." Mark said gently, "People go to those things with money to spend. We're just passing through, please." She clasped her mittened hands under her chin the way she used to when she wanted to stay up past bedtime. "It'll be fun to look. Maybe someone left something cool behind." Rex let out a short bark tail. Thumping once against the seat, Mark sighed. "Traitor," he muttered, scratching behind the dog's ear. "You're on her side, huh?" The dog licked his hand in reply. Mark turned the truck around, the tires crunching through the snow, and followed the narrow road the sign pointed toward. It wasn't even a real road, more like a single lane plowed through an open field. "If we get stuck, you're digging us out," he joked, glancing at Emma in the mirror. She grinned for the first time in days. For a while, no one spoke. The road wound past a line of rusted trailers and broken fences. In the distance, a cluster of low metal buildings appeared, their roofs sagging under snow. A dozen vehicles were parked out front, pickup trucks, SUVs, and a van with a sign that read, "Hanson's Storage." Mark slowed as they approached. A small crowd huddled near the entrance, stamping their feet for warmth. Someone was holding a clipboard calling out numbers. The air smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. "Dad, we made it," Emma said. Her cheeks flushed pink from excitement and cold. Mark parked off to the side and turned to face her. "Look, we're just going to watch. Okay, no bidding. We don't need any more junk." "Got it," she said, nodding solemnly, then added, "But we can still look. Yeah, we can look." He smiled despite himself. He grabbed his coat, zipped it to the collar, and opened the door. The cold hit like a wall. Rex jumped out first, shaking snow from his fur. The dog's breath came out in soft white clouds as he sniffed the air, alert but calm. Emma grabbed his leash and tucked herself against Mark's arm, and together they walked toward the group gathered at the first unit. The auctioneer, a man in a brown parka with a red scarf, was shouting over the wind. Unit 12. "Who's starting me off at 50, the crowd murmured. A man in a beanie called 50. Another shouted, 60. Mark watched the door lift, revealing a stack of old furniture and boxes marked kitchen. The air smelled of dust and motor oil. Emma's eyes darted around curiously. Rex stayed close, his ears flicking at every sound. They moved from one unit to the next. Mark couldn't help feeling out of place, these people with their wallets and confidence, their practiced nods. He was just a passerby, a man with nothing left to gamble. Still, something about the sound of locks breaking pulled him in. At the far end of the row stood one last unit, smaller, rusting at the edges. No one seemed interested. The auctioneer called out Unit 17, B. Anybody starting at 20. No response. Snow fell harder now, swirling around them in thin silver ribbons. Rex tugged suddenly on the leash, barking once, sharp and clear. "Easy boy," Mark said, frowning. The dog pulled again, head low, eyes fixed on the door of 17B. The auctioneer laughed. "Looks like the mutt's got better instincts than most of you." A few people chuckled. Mark kept his hands in his pockets and said nothing. His voice came out steady, even though his stomach nodded. They moved on as the bid went to someone else, and Emma squeezed his arm anyway. Mark looked at Rex, who wagged his tail once and barked low and certain. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of snow and rust. For reasons he couldn't explain, Mark felt the faint stir of something he hadn't in years, hope fragile as breath in the cold. He looked at the locked door and thought, whatever's in there, let it be kind. The cold bit harder as the morning wore on. The small crowd that had gathered near the storage facility was thinning quickly. Most people hunched against the wind, their breath pale in the cold. Mark stood among them, trying to ignore the sting on his cheeks. Emma clung to his side, her mittened hand gripping his sleeve. Rex sat at his feet, tail wrapped around his paws, eyes bright and alert. "All right, folks," the auctioneer's shouted voice muffled by his scarf. "We've got 5 more units left. Let's make this quick so we can all get home before we freeze solid." He laughed, but no one did. A few men shuffled closer, readying their cash and notes. Mark glanced down at his wallet, $67, every last cent they had. Enough for gas, maybe 2 meals if they were careful. He hadn't planned to spend a penny, but now, standing here with the rhythmic slam of metal doors and the smell of cold dust filling the air, something in him stirred. The first unit opened. A battered treadmill, boxes marked linens, and a broken mirror. Bids came fast, ending at 300. The second, a sofa. A few plastic tubs, an old fridge went for $450. Each door rose with a metallic screech like forgotten lives being unearthed. Mark didn't bid. He just watched his breath clouding in front of him, his thoughts wandering. Once he'd owned a home too. A mortgage, a garden, a future. All gone before Emma turned 10. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, softly. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." Rex gave a short bark, breaking his reverie. The dog had risen, ears pricked, staring down the long line of units. Mark followed his gaze. At the far end stood a small rust-stained door half buried in snow. No one else seemed interested. The auctioneer stomped toward it, rubbing his gloved hands. "Unit 29C," he announced. "Starting bid $20. Let's finish strong." The crowd didn't move. A man in a leather jacket muttered, "Looks empty." Another shrugged. The wind whistled through the gaps in the metal siding, carrying a faint rattling sound from within. Rex stepped forward, muscles tensing. He barked once, short, sharp, deliberate. "Hey," Mark whispered. "What is it, boy?" The dog barked again, then a third time, each sound precise, insistent. Emma tugged his sleeve. "Dad, maybe he smells something." Mark looked down at Rex, who stared back with eyes that seemed to say, "Trust me." "Come on," the auctioneer called impatiently. Anyone, $20.10. A few people laughed. Mark reached into his coat pocket, felt the crumpled bills. $67. He hesitated. It's crazy, he told himself. You can't waste what little you have. But then he looked at Emma's face, red from the cold, her eyes bright with the same light he'd once seen in her mother's. He raised his hand. 67, he said, voice steady. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. We got 67, anyone else, silence. A gust of wind swept snow across their boots. Sold. To the man with the shepherd, he declared, slapping his clipboard. The small crowd began to disperse, murmuring as they headed for their cars. Emma let out a delighted squeal. We won, Dad. We actually won. Mark laughed quietly, shaking his head. Guess we did. The auctioneer handed him a key. Unit's yours, cleared out within 48 hours. Sure, Mark replied. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. Rex trotted beside him as they approached the door. Up close, the metal looked even older, pitted with rust and streaked with ice. The padlock was frozen stiff. Mark breathed on it, warming the metal before sliding in the key. The lock clicked open with a reluctant sigh. He rolled the door upward. It creaked and shuddered before yielding, revealing darkness and the smell of old dust. A swirl of snow drifted inside as light spilled across the floor. Emma leaned forward. "It looks like a bunch of boxes." "Yeah," Mark said, "and maybe a few bad decisions." But there was something else, a wooden trunk against the far wall, its surface covered with a thin layer of frost. On top of it, a single sheet of yellowed paper was taped in place. The edges curled, the ink faded, but still legible. Mark brushed the dust away and read the words aloud. "To whoever finds this, please be kind." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Even the wind seemed to hush as if waiting. Emma's gloved hand slipped into his. "What do you think's inside?" she whispered. Mark stared at the trunk, the words echoing in his mind. "Please be kind." Rex stepped closer, sniffing the air, tail low, cautious but curious. Mark exhaled a cloud of breath, dissolving into the cold. "Let's find out," he said quietly, reaching for the lid. The metal door rattled in the wind as Mark knelt before the trunk. His fingers, stiff from the cold, hesitated on the worn brass latch. He glanced back at Emma and Rex standing in the doorway framed by the snow outside. "Ready?" he asked softly. Emma nodded, her breath forming white clouds. Rex tilted his head, tail still, eyes fixed on the chest, as if he understood something sacred was about to surface. Mark lifted the latch. The hinges groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep. Inside, layers of dust paper and the faint smell of cedar met them. The first thing he saw was a folded military jacket, olive drab, its fabric faded and edges frayed. The name stitched above the pocket read Hayes. Mark's hand paused there, brushing the letters with a quiet reverence. "He was one of us," he murmured. Beneath the jacket lay a bundle of letters bound with a string the color of rust. The envelopes were brittle, yellowed, some ink blurred by moisture. He picked one up carefully. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. "My dearest Anna," it began. His voice faltered. These weren't official documents, they were pieces of a life sealed and forgotten. Under the letters was something small and metallic that clinked against the wood when he moved it, a bank safety deposit key with a tag etched Box 47C, Bozeman Federal. Mark turned it over in his palm, a slow chill crawling down his spine. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a trail. "Dad, look," Emma said suddenly. She had found a photograph, its corners curling upward. It showed a man in uniform kneeling in front of a little girl, holding her in his arms. Next to them stood a German shepherd, proud, alert, its coat shimmering under sunlight that no longer existed. Rex stepped closer, sniffing the image, then looked up at Mark with a quiet whine. "He looks like Rex," Emma whispered. Mark felt his chest tighten. The resemblance was uncanny, the same build and the same eyes, and even a faint nick on the right ear. Captain Andrew Hayes. 1989, he read from the faded caption written beneath the photo. The name hung in the air like a memory that had been waiting to be spoken aloud. He'd heard it before, Hayes, the officer who disappeared after the Gulf War, rumored to have left behind a fortune meant for veterans' charity. The money had vanished, the case closed without explanation. Some said he'd run off. Others whispered that the truth had been buried. Mark stared at the photograph, feeling a strange mix of awe and sorrow. "He had a daughter," Emma said softly. "Like me." "Yeah," Mark replied, still staring. "And a dog like Rex." The connection hit him deeper than he expected. For a moment he could almost see Hayes, strong, steady, the kind of man who didn't quit even when the world turned away. A man who kept promises. Mark's own reflection in the glass of the frame looked back at him, older, worn, but carrying the same tired weight of duty. Dad, Emma asked, "You okay?" He nodded slowly, just thinking. He pulled the rest of the contents from the trunk. Old newspapers, a couple of medals dulled by tarnish, and a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, the initials AH embossed faintly in gold. He flipped through. Most pages were blank, but near the middle one, sentence stood out written in steady block letters. "If I don't make it back, the truth is in Box 47C." Mark stared at the words, heart-pounding. The key in his hand suddenly felt heavier. "Who do you think he was writing to?" Emma asked. "Someone he trusted," Mark said. or someone he hoped would come looking. The wind outside howled through the open door, scattering loose papers across the concrete. Rex barked once as if to call their attention to the world still turning around them. Mark gathered the papers, his hands trembling not from cold, but from the quiet realization that this discovery was no accident. Emma crouched beside him, watching as he placed the items carefully back into the trunk. Was he a hero, she asked. Most likely, Mark said. Heroes don't always make it home, but they try to leave something behind for those who do. She smiled faintly. Then maybe he left it for us. Mark looked at her, the innocence in her face breaking something open in him. He didn't know why, but it felt true. The thought that a man gone for 30 years might still be reaching out through time made his chest ache. He took a deep breath, eyes drifting from the photograph to the key resting in his palm. Bozeman Federal wasn't far 2 hours at most. We're not done here, he said quietly. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and soundless. Mark pocketed the key and closed the trunk, the sound echoing faintly through the storage lot like the closing of one chapter and the quiet promise of another waiting to begin. Morning sunlight struggled through the thin motel curtains, casting a pale glow across the small room. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, the open trunk beside him, its contents neatly arranged on the faded quilt. The jacket, the letters, the key, and the photo all laid out like puzzle pieces from another man's life. Emma sat at the small table eating cereal from a paper cup, while Rex dozed near the door, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitching with every sound. Mark's mind had been racing all night. He had cleaned the jacket, reread the letters, and stared at the photograph until the faces felt almost familiar. The name Bozeman Federal circled through his head again and again. He needed answers. Maybe the key led to the truth about Hayes. Maybe it led to something that could help him and Emma start over. He gathered a few items, the photo, one letter, and the key, and placed them into a small envelope. "I'll stop by town," he said quietly. "See if anyone can tell us what these might be worth." Emma looked up, spoon-frozen halfway to her mouth. "You're selling them." He shook his head. "Just getting information. We can't walk into a bank with no clue what we're holding." She nodded, though uncertainty clouded her eyes. Rex lifted his head, watching Mark pull on his coat. "Stay with her partner," Mark said. Rex gave a soft whine, but obeyed. The wind outside carried the last of the storm's chill. The roads were slick, the air sharp. Mark drove to an antique shop he'd passed the night before. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. A woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger. "Help you?" she asked. "Just wondering if you can tell me anything about these," he said, laying the photo and letter on the counter. The woman adjusted her glasses, leaning closer. Old military piece, looks like late 80s. The handwriting could be personal correspondence, maybe worth something to collectors if it's authentic. She paused, glancing at the name. Captain Andrew Hayes. "Where'd you say you found this storage auction in Billings County?" Mark said cautiously. Her brow furrowed. "You might want to be careful. I think I've heard that name before." Before she could elaborate, the door opened. A gust of cold air swept in along with a tall man in a gray wool coat. His hair was silver at the temples, his eyes pale and hard. He held a folded printout stamped Hanson Storage bidder log with Mark Sullivan highlighted in yellow. "Mr. Sullivan?" he asked, voice smooth and precise. Mark stiffened. "Do I know you?" The man smiled politely, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Howard Mercer. I represent the estate of Captain Andrew Hayes. I believe you recently came into possession of some personal items belonging to our client's family. I found your name on the bidder log they faxed me this morning," he added, tapping the printout. "Our client's family," Mark repeated slowly. "So, you're an attorney. Something like that." Mercer took a business card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Mercer Holdings. Private estate recovery. We'd like those items returned immediately. They fall under federal archival custody pursuant to a pending preservation review," he said, sliding a stamped notice across the counter. "I didn't steal anything," Mark said. "I bought a unit fair and square. You can check with the auction house." Mercer nodded calmly. "I have no doubt the purchase was legitimate, but certain contents were misappropriated years ago. They're government property. Returning them would be the prudent choice." His tone was polite, sharp a knife under silk. Mark's instincts screamed danger. Years of military service had taught him when someone was lying. "I'll think about it," he said evenly, slipping the envelope back into his coat. "Please do," Mercer replied. "I'd hate for a misunderstanding to become complicated." He turned to leave, pausing just before the door. "Some things are better left where they were buried, Mr. Sullivan." The bell jingled softly as he walked out. Mark stood there for a long moment, the sound of the wind outside creeping into his chest. "He's not local," the woman warned. Mark pocketed the card. "I noticed," he said. He drove back to the motel, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. No one followed. Still, unease clung to him like static. When he opened the door, Emma was playing cards on the floor with Rex. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a weird conversation." He didn't tell her the details. No point in scaring her yet. As night fell, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Emma fell asleep, clutching Rex's fur. Mark stayed awake, sitting by the small table with the envelope in front of him. He turned the key over and over in his hand. "Buried," Mercer had said. The word stuck with him. Buried meant hidden. Buried meant something someone didn't want found. Sometime after midnight, Rex stirred. The dog's head shot up, ears pricked. Then came the sound, a faint metallic click from outside, followed by the soft crunch of boots on snow. Mark froze. He reached for the baseball bat leaning against the wall. Rex growled deep and low, every muscle tense. The sound came again, this time at the truck door. Metal scraping. Someone was trying to break the lock. Mark cracked the curtain. A figure in dark clothing moved by the vehicle flashlight glinting off chrome. Before he could react, Rex lunged toward the door, barking ferociously. "Rex, wait!" Mark hissed, but the dog was already out. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. Snow rushed in. Mark saw the intruder whirl, slipping in the ice as Rex charged. The man bolted toward the road. The dog's growls echoed into the dark until there was a shout, then silence. Mark ran outside, heart pounding. The street was empty except for a set of footprints leading away, and drops of blood scattered across the snow. Rex returned moments later, limping slightly, but alive, muzzle flecked with red. Mark knelt, wrapping his arms around the dog. "They know," he whispered, voice trembling. "They know what we found." Rex pressed his head against Mark's chest, tail low. Snow kept falling, covering the tracks, burying the proof that someone had been there at all. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray over the quiet Montana town. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, forming puddles that reflected the weak winter light. Mark hadn't slept much. Every sound during the night had made him flinch. Every shadow felt like a watcher. He had cleaned Rex's paw, bandaged the small cut, and sat awake until dawn with the key on the table in front of him. Now, with Emma at a friend's place, one of the motel staff had kindly agreed to watch her for the day. The manager had extended a week's rate on credit, after Grace called in a favor from a local veterans group. Mark drove into town, the envelope tucked safely inside his coat. He needed help, but not from the police. Not yet. He needed someone who could make sense of what he had found. The public library sat near the courthouse, an old brick building with tall windows and a sign that creaked in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust, things that refused to die. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, pointed him toward the back corner. "Grace Hall's here most mornings," she whispered. "Still chasing ghosts, that one." Mark found Grace Hall sitting at a wooden table surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers. Her posture was straight despite her age, her face lined but intelligent. She looked up as he approached. "You're not here for a library card," she said dryly. "No, ma'am," Mark replied. "I think you wrote something years ago about a soldier, Captain Andrew Hayes." Her eyes flickered with surprise. "You know that name?" I found something, he said, sliding the photograph and letter across the table. A trunk in a storage unit. His jacket, his letters. a key to a deposit box, and then a man named Howard Mercer showed up claiming the items were his. Grace's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the photograph. "I haven't seen this face in 20 years, she murmured. Hayes disappeared in 91. I followed his story for a decade. Then one day, my editor told me to drop it, said the military had closed the file. I didn't listen, so they closed my career instead." Her voice softened. "You said Mercer, didn't you?" Mark nodded. She sat back, the numb sinking in like poison. He was a consultant on the investigation, an advisor they called him. I never trusted him. Too polished, too careful. She reached for the key in Mark's hand, turning it under the lamplight. Box 47C, Bozeman Federal. That bank merged years ago with Northern Trust in Billings. Mark leaned closer. Could the box still exist? Grace smiled faintly. If you're lucky, they didn't clean out the archives. Come on, soldier, let's find out. They drove together through the thin morning light, Grace guiding him with directions that seemed etched into her memory. The drive to Billings took 2 hours, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. When they reached the bank, Grace flashed her old press badge and introduced Mark as a veteran, assisting in a historical inquiry. The young clerk hesitated, then led them to a back room, filled with boxes and metal drawers labeled with fading numbers. At Grace's request, Evelyn Cross had faxed a records preservation notice to the branch manager authorizing temporary access to legacy boxes for verification. If it's still here, it would be under legacy accounts, she said, disappearing behind a door. Grace turned to Mark. If Mercer's tied to this, we have to move carefully. Men like him don't leave trails unless they want to. The clerk returned with a metal file box marked 47 lead to closed, account 1992. Dust rose as she set it on the counter. We're supposed to destroy these next quarter, she said. Guess today's your lucky day. Mark swallowed hard and inserted the key. The lock turned smoothly. Inside was a neat stack of documents sealed in plastic. Grace pulled on her glasses and began to read. This, she said, voice tightening, is Captain Hayes's last will and testament. It leaves his assets to a trust fund for wounded veterans and their families. She turned another page, frowning. But this is a transfer record. The trust was dissolved in 92, and the funds, nearly $2 million, were redirected to an account under the name Howard Mercer. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. Grace looked up, her eyes burning. He took everything. Hayes must have discovered it before he disappeared. She found a torn envelope wedged between files and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was faint but legible. If anyone finds this, please give it to those I promised they deserve justice. Mark's throat tightened. The simple words carried the weight of something sacred. He knew, Mark whispered. He knew someone would come looking. Grace nodded slowly. And Mercer's been waiting ever since, making sure no one does. They exchanged a long look, an understanding forged not from words but from shared purpose. We need to get this somewhere safe, Grace said. And we need proof Mercer knew the money wasn't his. Mark closed the box, securing the documents inside. He could feel the walls of the past pressing in the ghosts of duty and betrayal whispering through time. Rex's image flashed in his mind, the dog standing guard, the blood in the snow, the silent promise of loyalty. I'm not running anymore, he said quietly. Grace placed a hand on his arm. Good, because they'll come after you now. The clerk reappeared, asking if they were finished. Mark forced a nod. They left the bank together, the cold air biting, but the weight in Mark's chest lighter somehow. For the first time, he wasn't lost. He had a direction, a purpose. Somewhere behind them, in the shadowed hallways of power and silence, a man named Mercer was already realizing his mistake. The parking lot outside Northern Trust was nearly empty when they pulled in. The wind had picked up again, sharp and restless, carrying the smell of snow. Mark tucked the folder of documents under his arm while Grace walked beside him, her scarf fluttering behind. We'll stop by the sheriff's office next, she said quietly. We can't just sit on this. Mercer has influence, but so do the facts. Mark nodded, glancing at the reflection in the glass door. For a split second, he thought he saw movement, a dark shape near the corner of the lot, But when he turned, there was nothing but blowing dust and the low hum of traffic. They climbed out of the truck, Rex in the back seat, ears alert. The dog had been restless all morning, whining every time Mark left his sight. "Easy, boy," Mark said, patting his head. "We're okay." But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. Inside the bank, the air was too warm, the kind that made your thoughts slow. Grace spoke to a clerk about obtaining certified copies of the records. The woman disappeared into the archives. Mark leaned against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck, the folder pressed close to his chest. He could almost feel the weight of history inside it, the truth Hayes had tried to protect, the betrayal that had followed. Then the glass doors swung open. The sound of expensive shoes on tile cut through the silence. Mark turned. Howard Mercer walked in coat buttoned to the throat, his polished shoes leaving small wet marks on the floor. Beside him, a younger man in a dark suit carried a briefcase. "Mr. Sullivan," Mercer said, smiling thinly, "you move quickly. I admire that." Grace froze mid-step. "How did you know we were here?" she demanded. "Public record," Mercer said smoothly, "and a small world. I'd hoped we could resolve this without further trouble." The younger man opened the briefcase, revealing official-looking documents stamped with government seals. Mercer took one and laid it on the counter in front of Mark. "You are in possession of classified materials," he said, his voice calm-practiced. "Items belonging to the Federal Archives unlawfully removed from restricted property, under the Preservation Act that constitutes theft of government assets." The banker nearby glanced nervously between them. Mark didn't move. He had seen the same kind of authority before, the kind that cloaked itself in order to hide rot underneath. "You should leave," he said. "We're done here." Mercer smiled again, almost pitying. "I don't think you understand the situation. Hand me the documents and this goes away quietly. Keep them, and it becomes very unpleasant for you, for your daughter, for anyone helping you." His eyes flicked briefly toward Grace. Something cold and heavy settled in Mark's stomach. He took a slow breath, grounding himself the way he used to before patrols overseas. "You think you can scare me with papers," he said. "I've seen men hide behind flags before. I fought for justice once. I won't hand it to you just because you printed on government stationery." Mercer's smile faded. The air in the room shifted. Even the clerk behind the counter seemed to sense it. "You're making a mistake," Mercer said softly. "One that won't end well." He reached for the folder. Mark's hand moved faster. "Don't." The single word cut through the tension like a blade. Mercer's companion stepped forward, but before he could speak, a low growl filled the air. Rex had moved in front of Mark, his body rigid, teeth-bared eyes locked on Mercer. The growl deepened, vibrating through the floor. The banker gasped and took a step back. Grace, steady but pale, slipped her phone from her pocket and pressed a number. "Sheriff's Department," she said under her breath. Mercer's calm cracked for the first time. "Control your animal," he snapped. "He's only protecting what's right." Mark said, "You should understand that." The seconds stretched. Outside, faint sirens began to echo from down the street. Mercer's assistant leaned close to him, whispering something too low to hear. Mercer's jaw tightened. He looked at Mark one last time, his expression stripped of charm now, just ice and anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, soldier," he said, voice almost a hiss. "Walk away before you and your family regret it." Mark didn't flinch. "I already know who I'm dealing with," he replied. "The kind of man who takes what isn't his and calls it duty." The doors opened again. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, the sound of their radios crackling. Mercer straightened his coat, composure returning like a mask, sliding back into place. "This is a misunderstanding," he told them smoothly. "I was simply retrieving federal property." One of the officers gestured for him to step aside. "Sir, we'll sort it out outside." Grace gave the officers a brief nod of acknowledgement, her phone still in her hand. Mercer leaned closer to Mark as they guided him toward the exit. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You've just made enemies you can't afford." Then he was gone, leaving the smell of cold air and expensive cologne behind. Grace exhaled shakily. "That man doesn't bluff," she said. Mark watched the reflection of the police car lights flicker through the window, his mind already moving ahead. "Good," he murmured. "Neither do I." Rex sat back on his haunches watching the door long after Mercer disappeared, his ears still pointed toward the sound of sirens fading into the distance. 2 days after the confrontation, the storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean under a pale sun. But inside the small diner on Main Street where Mark and Grace sat hunched over coffee and cold pancakes, the tension still lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Grace had been up all night contacting old sources, cross-checking records, and finally reaching out to a friend she once trusted, a senior investigator in the Office of Federal Audits. "If we send the documents through official channels, they'll bury it," she said quietly, stirring her coffee though she hadn't taken a sip. "But I know someone who won't." Mark nodded, exhaustion etched deep into his face. He hadn't told Emma much, only that they were helping someone who never got a fair chance. She had simply smiled and said she believed him. The innocence in her eyes broke him more than Mercer's threats ever could. Grace's contact, an older woman named Evelyn Cross, agreed to meet them the next morning at a small government annex building. The office smelled of old files and disinfectant. Evelyn's sharp eyes flicked over the papers Grace laid before her. "These are original financial records," she murmured, tracing the seal with one finger. "And this," she lifted, "the last will of Captain Andrew Hayes. This is notarized, witnessed, and time-stamped 2 weeks before his disappearance." She leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "If this is real, Mercer didn't just mishandle an estate. He committed grand larceny and federal fraud. He stole everything Grace said. Hayes meant for his assets to fund a trust for veterans' families. Mercer dissolved it under the guise of bureaucratic transfer." Evelyn nodded grimly. "We'll verify it through the archives and the IRS transaction logs. It may take a few days, but if what you're saying checks out, it'll be enough to open a federal case." Mark shifted in his chair. What happens when Mercer finds out? Evelyn gave a thin smile. He already knows. But now, so do we. 3 days later, a report landed on Grace's desk with Evelyn's signature across the top. The findings were explosive. Nearly $2.7 million had been siphoned from Captain Hayes's trust in the early 1990s. The funds had been laundered through a series of shell companies, art galleries, consulting firms, and donation fronts, eventually leading to Mercer's private accounts. The report also verified the will as authentic. The purpose of the trust, written in Hayes's own steady hand, was heartbreakingly clear. These funds are to support the children of wounded veterans, ensuring they have access to education, medical care, and a home they can call their own. Grace read the line aloud in her office, her voice catching slightly at the end. Mark sat across from her, shoulders stiff, his hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "He tried to erase a man's legacy, and all it took was a few signatures." Grace looked at him, her expression soft. "You gave it back to him. That counts for something." News spread faster than either of them expected. Grace's article went live, and calls poured in from a town that once ignored him. But Mark didn't feel like one. When a television crew came to the motel asking for a statement, he refused. "This isn't about me," he told Grace. "It's about doing right by him and by every soldier who came home to nothing." The Department of Veterans Affairs released a public statement announcing its intent to reopen the Hayes Foundation pending completion of the audit and asset recovery. A federal magistrate issued a temporary freeze order on the identified accounts, and the relaunch would proceed under the name the Hayes Children's Trust. For the first time, those words meant something more than a ghost of paperwork. They meant hope. Grace received a call from Evelyn that evening. "The Justice Department is moving on Mercer," she said. "He's been detained under a sealed complaint as a material witness while investigators trace multiple offshore accounts tied to him. He won't walk away from this." Mark was silent on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Hayes can rest now." Evelyn hesitated. "There's one more thing. The media's calling you the man who exposed the theft. There's talk of compensation, a finder's reward, It could be substantial. Mark glanced across the motel room where Emma sat on the floor drawing with Rex beside her, the dog's head resting gently on her lap. "I don't want their money," he said softly, just enough to help her breathe easier. His eyes lingered on the small inhaler next to Emma's crayons. "That's all I'll ever need." Evelyn didn't press further. She only said, "You've done something rare, Mark. You gave a forgotten man his name back." That night, Grace came by with a stack of letters from veterans and their families. Some were handwritten, some typed all full of gratitude. A retired sergeant from Ohio wrote Hayes would have been proud to know one of his own finished the fight he couldn't. Mark read each note slowly, his chest heavy with something between sorrow and peace. Rex lay at his feet, eyes half closed but alert the way soldiers rest between battles. As the snow began to fall again outside the window, Mark stepped onto the small balcony. He looked toward the dark horizon where the mountains cut against the fading light. Somewhere in that quiet distance he imagined Hayes still wearing that old uniform, still watching over the people he swore to protect. "We did it, Captain," he whispered. "You can stand down now." Inside, Emma's laughter echoed faintly, bright and real. Rex wagged his tail, padding to the door. Grace stood by the table, her eyes glistening as she closed the folder one final time. "It's done," she said. "The truth's out." 3 months later, the Montana air had softened. The snow was gone, replaced by the scent of spring rain and pine, and the fields stretched wide and green under the pale sun. The old community center at the edge of town had been repainted, its flag raised again for the first time in years. A modest brass plaque now hung by the entrance, engraved with simple words, "Hayes Foundation for the Children of Those Who Served." Inside, rows of folding chairs filled the hall, and a quiet hum of conversation filled the space as veterans, families, and townsfolk gathered for the reopening ceremony. Mark stood at the podium, his suit borrowed but pressed his tie slightly crooked. Beside him sat Grace, notebook on her lap, her silver hair catching the morning light. Emma stood proudly near the front row, holding Rex's leash, the dog's posture as straight and solemn as any soldier's. When the mayor called his name, Mark stepped forward, clearing his throat. The microphone squealed briefly, then settled into silence. He looked out at the faces before him, some old, some young, all carrying the quiet weight of people who knew what sacrifice meant. "I'm not a man of speeches," he began, voice steady but low. "But I once served alongside men and women who believed that duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Captain Andrew Hayes was one of them. I never met him, but through his letters, through his words, I came to understand the kind of man he was. He didn't fight for medals or glory. He fought for the idea that no soldier's child should ever go hungry or feel forgotten. Today, we get to finish what he started." Applause rippled through the hall, quiet at first, then stronger. Mark glanced towards Grace, who nodded with quiet pride. She had worked tirelessly to help the foundation relaunch, coordinating with federal offices and veteran organizations to ensure the funds were placed exactly where Hayes had intended. Now, the Hayes Foundation would provide scholarships, housing support, and medical aid for children of injured service members. After the speeches, Grace approached the podium. "I've written many stories," she said, smiling toward Mark, "but this one reminded me why I started writing in the first place. It's called The Soldier Who Kept Another Soldier's Promise." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting a war, it's finishing the unfinished battles of someone who never came home. The audience stood applauding warmly. Mark felt his chest tighten, not with pride, but with gratitude for Hayes, for Grace, for the second chance he hadn't expected. Later that afternoon, the hall emptied, leaving behind the echo of footsteps and laughter. Mark walked outside, the late sunlight catching the newly unveiled bronze statue near the entrance. It was simple. A folded flag, a soldier's cap, and a child's hand resting on top. Beneath it were the words Hayes had written in his will. They deserve a home, a future, and a promise kept. Mark stood quietly before it, hands in his pockets. "We kept it, Captain," he murmured. "We really did." Emma came running up, her laughter bright in the warm air. Rex trotted beside her, his black and tan coat gleaming. "Dad." "Look what they gave him." She held up a small velvet box inside which rested a medal with a blue ribbon. The engraving read Companion of Service awarded to Rex. Mark smiled, kneeling beside the dog. "You earned it, buddy," he said softly, fastening the ribbon around Rex's neck. The shepherd's ears perked up as if he understood tail wagging with dignified pride. Emma bent down and kissed his nose. "I think he knew everything from the beginning," she said matter-of-factly. "The trunk, the photo, the key, he always went straight to them." Mark looked at her, then at Rex. The dog tilted his head, eyes warm and knowing. "Maybe," Mark said quietly, "maybe sometimes God doesn't send us signs. He sends us dogs." Grace joined them, slipping her notebook into her bag. "You know," she said, "every reporter dreams of a story like this." But the truth is, the story was never really mine. Mark smiled faintly. "It was Hayes's," he said. "And now, it belongs to every soldier who ever thought what they did didn't matter." Grace's eyes softened. "Then let's make sure no one forgets it." As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Mark, Emma, and Rex stood together before the flag. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of laughter from inside the hall. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt something quiet but unshakable, a sense of home. The kind that didn't come from walls or keys, but from knowing you'd done right by someone who couldn't. He looked down at his daughter, who was feeding Rex a biscuit from her pocket, and whispered, "We're gonna be just fine." Grace watched them from a distance, smiling. Her next article would be published in the Los Angeles Times the following Sunday, under a simple headline that spoke louder than any photograph. "A veteran, a child, and a dog who gave a lost hero his legacy back." Spring came slowly to Montana, the kind of season that felt like a deep breath after too long underwater. The snow melted into soft streams that traced the edges of the hills, and the air smelled of earth and new beginnings. 3 months after the reopening of the Hayes Foundation, Mark finally turned the key to a front door that was his. The house wasn't big, just a 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of Bozeman, but to him it was everything. White picket fence porch swing that creaked when the wind moved a patch of green grass where Rex could stretch out in the sun. For years, the word home had been something he said for Emma's sake. Now, standing in the doorway with a box under one arm, and his daughter's laughter echoing through the empty rooms, he realized it had become true. "This one's ours." "Dad?" Emma asked, her eyes wide as she looked around. "All ours," Mark said, smiling. "No more motels, no more packing up." She ran off to claim the smaller bedroom. Rex bounding after her, his tail knocking against the hallway walls like a drumbeat of joy. Mark carried the last box into the living room and set it on the floor. Inside were the few things he had kept from the journey: the letters, the medals, and the photograph of Captain Andrew Hayes with his daughter and the dog that looked so much like Rex. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Then he picked up the hammer and hung the frame on the wall above the mantel. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the window, catching on the glass, and for an instant it almost looked as if the man in the photo was smiling. Grace had called that morning. Her article had been nominated for a National Feature Award, but she talked more about the Foundation's progress than her own success. "We've already helped 23 families," she said. "Kids getting new braces, a scholarship, approved even a wheelchair fund." Mark had smiled quietly. He'd be proud, he said. "You should be too." Grace had laughed softly. "You're the one who finished his story, Mark. I just wrote it down." Emma's laughter turned into the sound of running water as she helped wash dishes. Rex barked once from outside, chasing a squirrel across the yard. The flag that Mark had hung by the porch earlier fluttered gently in the breeze, its colors bright against the sky. He stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, the boards creaking under his boots. From here he could see the mountains fading blue against the horizon, their peaks still dusted with snow. Emma soon joined him, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose and glowing in the golden light. "It's so quiet," she said, her voice full of wonder. "I like it. Quiet's good," Mark said. Means we did something right. She yawned, leaning against his arm, and within minutes her breathing slowed into the soft rhythm of sleep. He lifted her gently and laid her down on the porch swing, tucking the blanket around her. Rex trotted up the steps, circled once, and settled at his feet, his head resting across Mark's boots. For a long time, none of them moved. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the grass and the faint rustle of the flag above. Mark took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth settling in his chest. The stars appeared faint at first, then brighter. He looked toward the photo visible through the open window, catching the glint of the frame in the fading light. "You did it, Captain," he said softly. "Your promise made it home." The words lingered in the cool air. Somewhere deep inside he felt the kind of peace that didn't need applause or recognition. It was enough to know that the circle had closed, that justice had found its way through the snow and silence of so many years. Rex stirred his ears, twitching at some distant sound. Mark reached down his hand, brushing the dog's fur. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "You can rest now, too." The shepherd gave a low sigh and closed his eyes, content. The porch light flickered on automatically, bathing them in a soft yellow glow. Beyond the yard, the town lights twinkled like fallen stars scattered across the valley. Mark leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the swing where Emma slept. "You know," he whispered, "to the night I used to think the fight was behind me. But I guess it just changed shape. I'm still fighting, just in a quieter way." His voice softened to a murmur, almost a prayer. "I kept my word, Captain Hayes, and I'm still standing." The breeze picked up, carrying the faint smell of pine and rain. Somewhere a nightbird called. The flag rustled once more, steady and proud. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of his new world sink in the creak of the porch, swing the rhythm of his daughter's breathing, the heartbeat of a dog who had followed him through every storm. The war inside him, the one that had followed him home all those years ago, finally fell silent. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly. Not a threat this time, but a reminder that the world kept moving. Mark smiled, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you," he said to the man in the photo, to the life that had waited patiently for him to return. And as the first drops of rain began to fall softly against the porch roof, Mark reached down, resting a hand on Rex's back, his gaze lifting to the flag waving gently in the night air. If this story moved, you make sure to like and subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this. Which moment touched you the most? Mark's promise or Rex's loyalty? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below.